Okay, so in street preaching, we got to now think. We put the armor on. We put the spiritual armor that God has given us. Okay, that is the foundation of any ministry, and it's the foundation of preaching and street preaching. Okay, but once we put the armor on, we need to have an apologetic method. How are we going to approach apologetics? And there are different apologetic methods. There's what is called presuppositional apologetics, and what that is, it's looking not at evidences. You don't look at the evidences of Islam or the evidences of atheism. You look at their presuppositions. That's pre-ideas, ideas that inform the way you look at evidence. Okay, so there's presuppositional apologetics. There's what is called evidential apologetics, where you look at the evidences. There is classical apologetics, which is very similar to evidential apologetics. There is the culminative case apologetics, where you build up a case from a variety of arguments. There's a variety of different apologetic methods. Now, the two that I use, which seem to be contradictory, but I use them together, and Francis Schaeffer, a Christian apologist, also used these two methods. And I find these two methods are a very powerful tool in street preaching. Okay, and they can also be a method that you can apply in your preaching, in your pastoral work, in your youth work, etc. Alright, and the two methods that I use is presuppositionalism and evidentialism, especially the minimal fact approach to the defense of the resurrection. Right, those are the two methods I use in street preaching, and those two methods have always stood me in good stead. Whenever I've got questions or issues, these two methods have been a great help to me. Alright, now the presuppositional apologetics is basically, I'm going to link to a website for you to go. It's called True Forms, and there it will give you a whole link of a guy called Greg Banson. You need to read his articles, listen to his lectures, and that will give you more detail into what I'm going to say. We're only going to cover it a little bit here. Now, presuppositional apologetics says we don't give evidences, right? And that's where it seems contradictory, because I'm saying we give evidences. But just listen me out. Presuppositional is we look at people's presuppositions, pre-ideas, and we do an internal critique of them, because everybody looks at evidences with their own eyes. So an atheist will look at the evidence for the resurrection from an atheist perspective. A Muslim will look at the evidences of the resurrection of Christ from a Muslim perspective. So what we've got to do is challenge the atheist presuppositions. What's making them read that evidence the way it is? We've got to challenge the presuppositions of the Muslims, say, right? So what we do is we do an internal critique of a person's presuppositions. So for example, an atheist are materialists, most of them. So you'll ask questions to show that their materialism doesn't make sense. For example, the law of non-contradiction. If the atheist says that all that there is the material, you ask them, well, what about the law of non-contradiction? A is not B in the same context. Is that immaterial or material? They'll say it's immaterial, and then you'll say to them, but you just said all that there is the material. So what you've done is an internal critique of atheism, and it implodes on itself, right? So I use the presuppositional method, okay, where I go and question people's presuppositions and let them question mine. Alright? But then I also have an evidential side to my apologetics, where whenever I get questions from a Muslim, whenever I get questions from an atheist, I can pin them down with presuppositionalism. But sometimes I'll let them ask questions even though they can't answer the questions I'm giving them, and then I back it up with evidence. And I give them evidence of the resurrection, and I'll give them facts about Christ dying on a cross. We can prove it by Josephus, and I'll know the ins and outs of the arguments on the minimal fact approach of the resurrection. The minimal fact approach is, you'll get people say, well, how can you prove Jesus rose from the dead? You're just using the Bible. And you can say, well, without even using the Bible, I can just use the historical texts. And the Bible, without believing it's inspired, I can use some of the texts that even skeptics will excuse me, will acknowledge that we can use as history. And then I'll give them historical information outside the Bible. Excuse me. So the minimal fact approach of the resurrection is very helpful. And I use these presuppositionalism, and I use the minimal fact approach, and I put them together, and I use them together, and I find that that gives me a really, really helpful methodology in dealing with people in apologetics on the street. When they're asking me questions, when I'm being faced by hostile questions, when I'm being faced with lots of different questions coming at me from all sides, those are the two methods that I've always fall back on and always help me to deal with what's happening around me. Alright? I'm going to link to the minimal fact approach, and I'm going to link to the presuppositional approach, and you're going to have to go on a course, study the lectures, and there are courses on the Truthform website that you can do on presuppositional apologetics, and there are lectures and debates that you can go and watch of the minimal fact approach, and I'll link to the two scholars that are really helpful there. And those are going to be helpful for you, okay?